Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of helping people, but she never imagined it would lead her to a dusty military base in Afghanistan. At 24, she was one of the youngest combat medics in her unit, carrying a heavy medical bag instead of extra ammunition. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she was too gentle for war, too caring to be in such a harsh place. The morning sun cast long shadows across the base as Sarah checked her medical supplies for the third time. Today's mission was supposed to be routine. A convoy escort through a relatively quiet valley to deliver medical supplies to a remote village. The intelligence reports showed minimal threat levels, and the local commanders assured them it would be an easy day. "Hey, Doc," called out Sergeant Mike Collins, using the nickname everyone had given her despite her protests that she wasn't actually a doctor. "You ready for another peaceful drive through paradise?" His sarcasm was thick, but his smile was genuine. Mike had become something of a protective big brother to Sarah since she joined the unit 6 months ago. Sarah adjusted the straps on her medical pack and nodded. She had learned not to take the teasing personally. In this brotherhood of soldiers, nicknames and gentle mockery were signs of acceptance. Still, she sometimes felt the weight of being different, the one who heals instead of hurts, the one who carries bandages instead of bullets. The briefing room was stuffy and filled with cigarette smoke when Captain Reynolds called the team together. 23 soldiers would be making the trip, split between 4 armored vehicles. Sarah would ride in the third vehicle with the medical supplies positioned in the middle of the convoy, where she would be safest and most accessible if anyone got hurt. "Remember, we're guests in their country," Captain Reynolds said, pointing at the map spread across the table. "We go in, deliver the supplies, maybe share some tea with the village elders, and come home. Simple as that." He looked directly at Sarah when he mentioned the tea, knowing she always tried to connect with the local civilians during these missions. As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and purpose that came with every mission. She had joined the army to make a difference, to help people who needed it most. The recruiting poster in her hometown had shown medics helping injured soldiers, and that image had stayed with her through basic training and all the way to this moment. The convoy vehicles hummed to life, their engines creating a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Sarah's chest. She climbed into the back of the third vehicle, settling in between cases of medical supplies and boxes of vaccines for the village clinic. The metal walls around her were covered in scratches and dents from previous missions, each mark telling a story she probably didn't want to know. Private Johnson, barely 19 and fresh from basic training, sat across from her looking nervous. This was only his second mission outside the base, and Sarah could see his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his rifle. She remembered her own first mission and how terrified she had been, though she had tried hard not to show it. "First time is always scary," Sarah said softly, offering him a reassuring smile. "Just stick to your training and everything will be fine." She had learned that sometimes the best medicine was simply a calm voice and a reminder that they were all in this together. The convoy pulled out of the base gates and onto the dirt road that would take them through the valley. Sarah watched the landscape roll by through the small window. Brown hills dotted with scrub brush, occasional goat herders with their flocks, and children who would wave at the passing vehicles. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, so different from the green fields of her home in Kansas. As they drove, Sarah thought about the letter she had written to her mother the night before but hadn't sent yet. How could she explain what it was like here? How could she describe the feeling of being the person everyone turned to when things went wrong, the responsibility of carrying lives in her hands, the strange mix of fear and pride that came with wearing the uniform? The radio crackled with routine check-ins between the vehicles. "Alpha team, all clear. Bravo team, nothing to report. Charlie team, road looks good ahead." The voices were calm and professional, exactly what Sarah had come to expect on these routine missions. She allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking about the children they would meet at the village and wondering if the little girl with the broken arm from their last visit had healed properly. 30 minutes into the journey, they passed through a narrow section of the valley where rocky hills rose on both sides of the road. Sarah noticed that the radio chatter had become less frequent, and Private Johnson seemed to be gripping his rifle even tighter. The driver called back that they were about 15 minutes from the village, and Sarah began mentally preparing for the work ahead. checking on previous patients, distributing vaccines, maybe helping with minor injuries or illnesses. She had no idea that in less than 10 minutes everything she thought she knew about her role as a medic would change forever. She had no idea that the quiet valley ahead held an ambush that would test every principle she had been taught about healing versus fighting. Most importantly, she had no idea that she was about to discover something about herself that would surprise everyone, including her own family back home. The convoy continued forward, carrying Sarah toward a moment that would define not just her military career, but her understanding of what it truly meant to protect the people she had sworn to help. The first explosion shattered the peaceful morning like thunder from a clear sky. Sarah felt the vehicle lurch violently to the left as the lead truck hit an improvised explosive device buried in the road. The blast was so loud that for a moment everything went silent in her ears except for a high-pitched ringing. Dust and debris rained down on their vehicle as the driver slammed on the brakes. IED! IED! The radio erupted with urgent voices as the convoy came to an emergency stop. Through the dust cloud ahead, Sarah could see the twisted metal of what had been the first vehicle. Her training kicked in immediately. There would be wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. She grabbed her medical bag and reached for the door handle, but Sergeant Collins' voice stopped her cold. "Stay down, Doc. This isn't over." His words proved prophetic as the hills around them suddenly came alive with muzzle flashes. The ambush had been carefully planned. The explosive device was just the beginning. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves on the rocky slopes on both sides of the narrow valley, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped the convoy in the open. Bullets began striking their vehicle with metallic pings and sharp cracks. Sarah dropped to the floor as ordered, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was nothing like the training exercises back at base. The sounds were sharper, more violent, more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Private Johnson was pressed against the opposite wall, his face pale with fear. The radio crackled with desperate status reports. "Alpha is down, multiple casualties. We've got wounded in Bravo. Charlie team, can you see the shooters?" The calm, professional voices from 30 minutes ago had been replaced by urgent shouts and the background noise of gunfire. Sarah realized with growing horror that the first vehicle, the one that hit the explosive, contained 4 of her friends. Captain Reynolds's voice cut through the chaos on the radio. "All teams, return fire and establish defensive positions. Medic, we need you up front now." Sarah looked toward the front of their vehicle where Sergeant Collins was firing through a gun port. The request was clear, but getting to the wounded soldiers meant crossing open ground under enemy fire. "I have to go," Sarah said, more to herself than to anyone else. She had trained for this moment, studied battlefield medicine, practiced treating wounds under simulated fire, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of knowing that stepping outside meant putting herself directly in the line of fire. Medics were supposed to be protected under the rules of war, but the enemy fighters in these hills didn't seem to care about such rules. Sergeant Collins looked back at her, his face grim. "Doc, it's too hot out there. They'll cut you down before you take 5 steps." As if to emphasize his point, another burst of automatic rifle fire struck their vehicle, the bullets sparking off the armored sides. Sarah could hear the distinct whine of ricochets and the heavier thud of rounds that found their target. But through the gunfire and shouting, Sarah could hear something else, the sound that haunted every medic's nightmares. Someone was calling for help. A wounded soldier's voice, weak but desperate, calling out, "Medic!" from somewhere near the destroyed lead vehicle. It was the sound that had driven her to join the army in the first place, the cry that meant someone needed her skills to survive. Private Johnson was hyperventilating now, his breathing rapid and shallow. "What do we do? What do we do?" he kept repeating. Sarah realized that despite being the youngest and supposedly most inexperienced person in the vehicle, everyone was looking to her for answers. In this moment of chaos and violence, they needed her calm presence as much as any wounded soldier would need her medical skills. "Johnson, breathe with me," she said firmly, making eye contact with the panicked soldier. "In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Just like in training." She demonstrated the breathing technique while bullets continued to strike their vehicle. Somehow helping Johnson helped calm her own nerves. This was what she was trained for, staying cool under pressure, thinking clearly when others couldn't. The radio crackled again with Captain Reynolds's voice. "Medic, we have at least 3 critical wounded in the lead vehicle. They're not going to make it unless we get medical attention to them in the next few minutes." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to visualize the terrain between her position and the destroyed vehicle. Approximately 50 yards of open ground with minimal cover, overlooked by enemy positions on both sides. Sergeant Collins was still firing steadily, but Sarah noticed that the enemy fire seemed to be concentrated on the front and rear vehicles, trying to prevent anyone from escaping. The attackers wanted to pin them down and eliminate the entire convoy. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned ambush designed to cause maximum casualties. "How many shooters do you think?" Sarah asked Collins, trying to assess the tactical situation. If she was going to risk her life to reach the wounded, she needed to understand what she was facing. Collins paused his firing long enough to give her a quick situation report. "At least 8, maybe 10 fighters. They've got us in a crossfire from both sides of the valley. The good news is they don't seem to have any heavy weapons. No rocket launchers or machine guns that I can see. The bad news is they're dug in pretty good up in those rocks." He resumed firing as another burst of enemy bullets struck their position. Sarah made her decision. 3 soldiers were dying in that lead vehicle, while she sat safely in the back of an armored truck. She hadn't joined the army to hide when people needed her help. She opened her medical bag and began pulling out the supplies she would need: trauma bandages, tourniquets, morphine syringes, and pressure dressings. Everything had to fit in the smaller bag she could carry while running. "Doc, what are you thinking?" Collins asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm thinking that those soldiers up front didn't sign up to die in a ditch while their medics sat in the back doing nothing," Sarah replied, checking her gear one final time. "Cover me as best you can. I'm going to get our people." Sarah took 3 deep breaths, said a quick prayer, and pushed open the heavy door of the armored vehicle. The sound hit her immediately. The sharp crack of rifle fire, the whine of bullets passing overhead, and underneath it all, the voice calling for help. The desert air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of explosives. She had exactly 50 yards to cover, and every step would be under enemy observation. The first 10 yards went better than expected. Sarah stayed low and moved fast, using the bulk of their vehicle as cover while she oriented herself toward the destroyed lead truck. The enemy fighters seemed focused on the soldiers returning fire from defensive positions, giving her a brief window of opportunity. But as she cleared the protection of her vehicle, the shooting suddenly intensified. A bullet struck the ground inches from her left foot, sending up a spray of dirt and rocks. Another passed so close to her head that she felt the displacement of air. Sarah dove behind a small boulder, her heart racing as she realized how exposed she was. From this position, she could see the lead vehicle clearly for the first time, and the sight made her stomach clench with dread. The explosion had flipped the heavy truck onto its side. The front end was completely destroyed, twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the road. But more importantly, she could see movement inside the wreckage. At least 2 soldiers were still alive, trapped in the overturned vehicle. One of them was Corporal Davis, a quiet kid from Texas who always shared his care packages from home with everyone. "Over here! Medic, over here!" Davis was calling out, his voice strained with pain. Sarah could see blood on his uniform, and the awkward angle of his left arm suggested a serious fracture, but he was conscious and alert, which meant he probably wasn't the most critically injured. The silence from the front of the vehicle worried her more than Davis's obvious injuries. Sarah keyed her radio with one hand, while staying pressed against her rocky shelter. "Collins, I can see at least 2 wounded in the lead vehicle. I need covering fire to get the rest of the way up there." The response came back immediately, along with increased fire from her unit's positions. The enemy fighters seemed to realize what was happening and began directing more attention toward her position. The next 20 yards were the longest of Sarah's life. She sprinted from boulder to boulder, zigzagging across the open ground while bullets tracked her movement. At one point she stumbled and fell, scraping her hands and knees on the rocky ground. But she rolled behind cover just as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the dirt where she had been standing. When she finally reached the overturned vehicle, Sarah was breathing hard and shaking with adrenaline. Up close, the destruction was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. The smell of diesel fuel and burnt metal was overwhelming, and she could hear the ominous hiss of escaping gas somewhere in the wreckage. They needed to work fast, not just because of the ongoing firefight, but because the vehicle might catch fire at any moment. "Davis, can you hear me clearly?" Sarah called out as she squeezed through the twisted rear door opening. The interior of the vehicle was a chaos of scattered equipment, broken glass, and worse things she tried not to think about. Davis was pinned by his legs but conscious and responsive. The soldier next to him, Private Torres, was unconscious with blood seeping from a head wound. "Doc, thank God you're here," Davis gasped. "Torres got hit bad when we flipped. He was awake a few minutes ago, but then he just stopped talking. And I think—" He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I think Martinez and Singh up front are gone. I can't hear them anymore." Sarah forced herself to compartmentalize the grief and focus on the living. She quickly assessed Davis's injuries. Definitely a broken arm, possible internal bleeding from the way he was holding his ribs, but stable enough to wait a few minutes. Torres was the priority. The head wound wasn't immediately life-threatening, but he showed signs of serious concussion and possible skull fracture. Working in the cramped, twisted space of the overturned vehicle while gunfire continued around them, Sarah began emergency treatment. She started an IV line on Torres to prevent shock, applied pressure bandages to Davis's visible wounds, and gave both men morphine for pain. Her hands moved automatically through procedures she had practiced hundreds of times, but never under these conditions. "How are we going to get out of here, Doc?" Davis asked, wincing as Sarah splinted his broken arm. The question had been nagging at her too. Getting into the wreckage had been dangerous enough, but extracting 2 wounded soldiers under fire seemed almost impossible. Torres couldn't walk and Davis couldn't move his legs properly due to the way debris had fallen across them. That's when Sarah heard the sound that changed everything. A new voice on the radio, not one of her unit speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The enemy fighters had somehow gotten access to their radio frequency and were coordinating their movements. Worse yet, she heard the distinctive sound of boots on rock coming from multiple directions. The ambush was about to become a ground assault. "Collins, they're moving in closer," she radioed back to her unit. The response was immediate and alarming. Her unit was taking so much fire that they couldn't maintain their positions much longer. Captain Reynolds was coordinating a tactical withdrawal to a more defensible position, further back down the valley. But that would mean abandoning the lead vehicle and everyone in it. Sarah looked at the 2 wounded soldiers depending on her. Davis was trying to put on a brave face, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Torres was still unconscious, completely helpless and relying on her medical care to keep him stable. Behind them in the front of the vehicle, 2 more of their friends lay silent. The thought of leaving them all here for the enemy fighters was unthinkable. "Doc, you need to get out of here while you can," Davis said quietly. "Take Torres if you can carry him, but don't stay here because of me. That's an order from a senior enlisted man." He tried to smile, but pain and exhaustion made it more of a grimace. Sarah realized he was giving her permission to make an impossible choice, save who she could and leave the rest. But as she listened to the approaching footsteps and voices, another sound reached her ears. The metallic click of someone checking their rifle, preparing to fire. The enemy fighters weren't just getting closer, they were almost on top of their position. In another minute or 2, this would no longer be a rescue mission. It would be a fight for survival, and medics weren't trained for that kind of fight, or so everyone had always told her. The first enemy fighter appeared around the front of the overturned vehicle, just as Sarah was checking Torres's pulse. She saw him before he saw her. A young man, probably not much older than herself, carrying an assault rifle and moving carefully through the wreckage. For a split second, they made eye contact through the twisted metal and broken glass. Time seemed to freeze as both of them processed what they were seeing. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could call out, identify herself as a medic, hope that he would respect the Geneva Conventions and allow her to continue treating the wounded. But something in his eyes told her that mercy wasn't on his agenda. He was already raising his rifle when Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. The M4 rifle that belonged to the vehicle's driver lay just within reach, thrown clear during the explosion but still functional. Sarah had trained with the M4 during basic training, though she had never expected to use it in combat. Medics carried pistols for self-defense, but rifles were for fighters. Except right now, the only thing standing between her, patience and an enemy fighter, was her willingness to become something she had never planned to. Sarah grabbed the rifle and brought it up just as the enemy fighter spotted the movement inside the vehicle. Her first shot was pure instinct and adrenaline, not carefully aimed, but close enough to make him dive for cover behind a piece of debris. She had crossed a line that every medic was taught never to cross, but looking at Davis and the unconscious Torres, she felt no regret about it. "Doc, what are you doing?" Davis whispered urgently. Medics don't fight. If they see you with a weapon, they'll treat you like a combatant. You'll lose your protected status. He was right according to everything they had been taught, but Sarah realized that their attackers didn't seem to care much about international laws anyway. Right now, I'm not just a medic, Sarah replied, keeping the rifle trained on the area where the enemy fighter had taken cover. I'm the only thing keeping you two alive. As if to prove her point, she heard voices approaching from the other side of the vehicle. At least 2 more fighters were moving in to surround their position. Her radio crackled with frantic calls from her unit, but they were too far away and under too much fire to help. The second fighter tried to approach from Torres's side of the vehicle, thinking he could catch them by surprise. But Sarah had been listening to his footsteps on the gravel and was ready when he appeared. This time her shot was more deliberate, aimed center mass just like she had been taught in basic training. The man dropped immediately and Sarah felt a mixture of shock and determination wash over her. She had just shot another human being. 6 months ago, she had been studying anatomy to learn how to heal people, and now she was using that same knowledge to stop someone from killing her patients. The moral complexity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. But Davis's pained breathing and Torres's weak pulse reminded her that there would be time for philosophical considerations later. More coming from the left, Davis called out, having positioned himself where he could watch one direction despite his injuries. Sarah spun to see 3 fighters moving toward them in a coordinated assault. They had apparently decided that whatever was in the overturned vehicle was worth the risk of a direct attack. Sarah realized with growing dread that they might be right. Her medical supplies, her patients, and now her rifle made this position strategically important. The firefight that followed was nothing like the movies. It was chaotic, terrifying, and over almost before it began. Sarah fired controlled bursts, trying to conserve ammunition while keeping the attackers at bay. She wasn't trying to be a hero or win any medals. She was simply trying to keep herself and her patients alive until help could arrive. Each shot was motivated by the most basic medical principle of all. First, do no harm to those under your care. One of the attacking fighters managed to get close enough to throw a hand grenade toward their position. Sarah saw it coming and had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Without thinking, she threw herself over Torres's unconscious body, while pulling Davis down as much as his injuries would allow. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and shrapnel tore through the metal walls of the vehicle, but the 3 of them survived. When the dust settled, Sarah's ears were ringing and she could taste blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue. But she was alive, her patients were alive, and the immediate threat seemed to have ended. She could hear her unit's vehicles approaching from down the valley. The cavalry was finally coming, but the fight wasn't over yet. Doc, you saved our lives, Davis said quietly, looking at her with something approaching awe. I never thought, medics aren't supposed to. He trailed off, unable to find the words for what he had just witnessed. Sarah understood his confusion because she felt it too. Everything she had been taught about her role, everything she had believed about herself, had been challenged in the space of a few terrifying minutes. I didn't have a choice, Sarah replied, checking Torres's vital signs again. The unconscious soldier was stable but needed evacuation to a proper medical facility as soon as possible. Sometimes saving lives means more than just bandaging wounds. As she spoke, Sarah realized that she meant it. The rifle in her hands didn't make her less of a medic. In this situation, it made her a better one. The sound of friendly voices calling out indicated that her unit had fought their way up to the crashed vehicle. But as Sarah prepared to hand over her patients to the arriving soldiers, she heard something that made her blood run cold. More enemy fighters were approaching from the far side of the valley, and this time they sounded like a much larger force. The ambush wasn't over, it was just getting started. Sergeant Collins appeared at the rear of the overturned vehicle, his face showing relief mixed with amazement. Doc, we heard shooting from this position. Are you? He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the rifle in Sarah's hands and noticed the enemy fighters who wouldn't be getting back up. For a moment nobody spoke as the implications of what had happened began to sink in. Torres needs immediate evacuation, Sarah said, switching back into medic mode as if the past few minutes of combat had been just another medical procedure. Possible skull fracture, definite concussion, and he's been unconscious for almost 20 minutes. Davis has a compound fracture of the left arm and suspected internal bleeding, but he's stable for now. She rattled off the medical assessment while still keeping the rifle ready, scanning for more threats. Collins helped her extract Torres from the wreckage while other soldiers established a defensive perimeter. As they worked, Sarah could hear the radio chatter about the approaching enemy reinforcements. Intelligence estimated at least 30 fighters moving in from 3 directions, apparently determined to finish what they had started. The original ambush had been just the opening move in a much larger attack. "We need to move now," Captain Reynolds announced as he reached their position. "Extraction helicopters are inbound, but they can't land while we're under heavy fire. We're going to have to fight our way to the landing zone." He looked at Sarah and the wounded soldiers, then at the tactical situation they were facing. The math was simple and brutal. They couldn't carry multiple wounded soldiers while fighting a running battle against superior numbers. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. "Sir, I'll stay with the wounded and hold this position until the helicopters arrive. This vehicle provides good cover, and someone needs to keep Torres stable during transport." She hefted the rifle she had claimed from the wreckage. "I can keep them safe until you can get air support here." The suggestion sparked immediate protests from several soldiers. "Doc, that's not your job," Collins argued. "You're a medic, not a rifleman. We'll figure out another way to get everyone out." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching enemy fighters grew louder. They were running out of time and options. Captain Reynolds studied Sarah's face for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't been present when she first joined the unit. "Can you hold this position for 15 minutes?" he asked seriously. "That's how long until the helicopters arrive. And we need to keep the landing zone clear for them." The weight of command was evident in his voice. He was asking a medic to become a soldier, fully understanding what that meant. "I can hold it," Sarah replied with a confidence that surprised even herself. She had already crossed the line from healer to fighter, and now she was volunteering to stay in the most dangerous position while her unit withdrew. But looking at Torres's pale face and Davis's determined expression, she knew she couldn't abandon them. This was still a medical mission, even if it required unconventional methods. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as the unit prepared for tactical withdrawal. Extra ammunition was left for Sarah, along with additional medical supplies and a radio for coordinating with the incoming helicopters. Davis insisted on staying conscious to help spot threats. Despite the pain from his injuries, Torres remained unconscious but stable, his breathing steady under Sarah's continued care. As her unit moved toward the landing zone, Sarah found herself alone with her patients in an overturned vehicle, surrounded by approaching enemy fighters. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had joined the army to save lives, and now she was preparing to take them in order to protect the lives under her care. The rifle felt strange in her hands, heavier than it had during training, weighted with implications she was still processing. The first probe came from the north side of the vehicle, 2 fighters trying to get close enough to determine how many soldiers remained in the position. Sarah let them approach within 30 yards before opening fire, not because she enjoyed it, but because allowing them to get closer would compromise her patient's safety. Her shots were accurate and effective, sending the survivors scrambling back to cover. "Nice shooting, Doc," Davis whispered. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah realized that she didn't have a good answer. The marksmanship had come naturally, as if all her medical training and precision and steady hands had transferred directly to combat skills. She had been taught to save lives with surgical precision, and now she was ending them with the same careful attention to detail. The radio crackled with updates from Captain Reynolds. "Medic, helicopter ETA is 8 minutes. How's your situation?" Sarah looked around at the increasing number of muzzle flashes in the rocks around them, and gave the only answer that made sense. "Still here, still fighting." The response came back immediately. "Outstanding. Air support is 2 minutes out." As if summoned by the promise of help, the enemy launched their most serious assault yet. At least a dozen fighters approached from multiple directions, apparently hoping to overwhelm her position before air support could arrive. Sarah found herself fighting not just for her patients' lives, but for the principle that a medic's duty didn't. And when the shooting started, it just became more complicated. The sound of approaching helicopters mixed with gunfire as Sarah prepared for what she hoped would be the final minutes of the longest day of her life. She had started the morning as someone who healed, and she would end it as someone who fought. But most importantly, she would end it with her patient still alive, still breathing, still under her protection. Sometimes, she realized, Being a good medic meant being willing to become something more than just a medic. The distinctive roar of Apache attack helicopters filled the valley as air support arrived with devastating precision. Sarah watched through the twisted metal of her shelter as rockets streaked into the hillsides where enemy fighters had been positioned. The sudden shift from desperate defense to overwhelming firepower was both relief and revelation. This was what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. Doc. Helicopter incoming for medical evacuation. Captain Reynolds' voice crackled over the radio. Sarah could see the medevac helicopter approaching the landing zone her unit had secured, its rotors kicking up clouds of dust as it prepared to land. But getting Torres and Davis to that helicopter meant crossing 200 yards of open ground that might still contain hidden enemies. Torres began stirring as the helicopter noise grew louder, his eyes opening for the first time since the explosion. "What happened?" he asked weakly, trying to focus on Sarah's face. She felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. Consciousness was a good sign, indicating that his head injury might be less severe than she had feared. But he still needed immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility. "You hit an IED," Sarah explained while checking his pupils and pulse. "You've been unconscious for about an hour. We're getting you out of here now, but I need you to stay awake and talk to me, okay?" Torres nodded slightly, wincing at the movement, but his responses were appropriate and his vital signs were stable. Davis watched the interaction with obvious relief. They had all been worried about their unconscious friend. The evacuation team approached their position with professional efficiency. 2 soldiers with a stretcher, a flight medic with additional medical equipment, and Sergeant Collins providing security. As they prepared to move Torres, the flight medic looked at Sarah with obvious curiosity. Word had already spread about the medic who had fought off attackers while treating wounded. "Soldiers, I hear you've had an interesting morning," the flight medic said while helping secure Torres to the stretcher. "Command is calling it above and beyond the call of duty." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention and praise. To her, she had simply done what needed to be done to protect her patients. The rifle and the fighting had been tools, no different from bandages or morphine, necessary medical equipment for an unusual situation. As they moved toward the landing zone, Sarah stayed close to her patients, monitoring their conditions and providing reassurance. Davis was walking with assistance, his broken arm immobilized but his spirits remarkably good considering everything that had happened. Torres remained conscious and alert, asking questions about the other soldiers in their vehicle and showing appropriate concern for his friends. The medevac helicopter was a welcome sight after the chaos of the morning. Sarah helped load her patients while providing detailed medical reports to the flight crew. As Torres was secured inside, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Thank you, Doc," he said quietly. "Davis told me what you did. You saved our lives." Sarah squeezed his hand in response, unable to find words for the emotions swirling inside her. Captain Reynolds appeared beside her as the helicopter prepared for takeoff. "Sarah, I need to ask you about what happened back there. The preliminary report suggests you engaged multiple enemy fighters while treating wounded soldiers. Is that accurate?" His tone was official but not accusatory. He needed to understand what had occurred for his after-action report. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied simply. "The wounded soldiers were under direct threat. I neutralized the threats and continued medical treatment until evacuation arrived." She realized as she spoke that her language had changed, becoming more military and less medical. The experience had altered not just her actions but her entire perspective on what it meant to serve. As they walked back toward their vehicles, Collins approached with a mix of admiration and confusion on his face. "Doc, I've been in the Army for 12 years and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Where did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering, trying to understand it herself. "I learned it today," she said finally. "When someone threatens your patients, you do whatever it takes to protect them. The rifle was just another medical tool." She paused, looking at the overturned vehicle where she had made her stand. "I think I always knew I could fight if I had to. I just never had to before." The convoy formed up for the return journey to base, but the atmosphere was completely different from the morning's departure. Word had spread quickly through the unit about their medic's actions, and Sarah found herself receiving nods of respect and admiration from soldiers who had previously seen her as someone to be protected rather than someone who could protect others. Private Johnson, who had been so frightened during the initial attack, sought her out before they departed. "Doc, I wanted to thank you for helping me calm down back there. And I wanted to say that after seeing what you did today, I'm not worried about being in your unit anymore. If our medic can fight like that, I figure we're in good hands." His words carried the simple sincerity of someone who had been genuinely inspired. As the convoy pulled away from the ambush site, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just a few hours. She had started the day believing that medics don't fight, that healing and hurting were opposite ends of an unbridgeable spectrum, but she had learned that sometimes protecting life required being willing to take life, that the oath to do no harm sometimes meant harming those who threatened the innocent. The letter to her mother would be different now. Instead of struggling to explain what it felt like to be a medic in a war zone, she would write about discovering that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She would write about the moment when all the principles and training came together, not in a classroom or training exercise, but in a real situation where lives hung in the balance. Back at base that evening, Sarah cleaned and returned the rifle she had borrowed, then sat down to complete her medical reports on Torres and Davis. Both men were expected to make full recoveries, Torres from his head injury and Davis from his broken arm and other wounds. The mission had accomplished its objective. Medical supplies delivered, patients evacuated, no friendly casualties. But everyone involved knew that something significant had changed. They no longer said that medics don't fight. At least not around Sarah Martinez.